G'day, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac. In the last session we added the Game Center login, but if we are not a game, maybe we want to log in on multiple devices using some other cloud database. So over the next 3 tutorials we're going to log in with remote saves using CloudKit, Google Firebase and Facebook. This lesson we'll be looking at CloudKit. CloudKit is Apple's cloud solution, the iCloud, and it's pretty straightforward for what we're looking to do. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is get a copy of the project. So you go to source code control. You want to download login 4 for the commencement and follow along. Save that to the desktop. That's all opened up. And then if you want the final project at the end, you want to go to the same place, source code clone, and get login 5. And you can download that. You put that on the desktop as well. Okay, now let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is configure our project for CloudKit. So click on login in the top left hand corner, and then we've got the login target. We choose capabilities and we click on the on off switch for CloudKit, and we want to have key value storage, and we want to click on CloudKit as well. We want to use a default container, and essentially what happens is a container is all the data that belongs to an application. You can have multiple containers, and the default container is simply called iCloud, and then the app identifier com.swiftalmanac.login for your app. Yours won't be com.swiftalmanac, you can change yours to whatever. And that means that only your app is going to be able to access this data store if it's in Apple's iCloud. And also, you can see there's this CloudKit dashboard. We'll go to the CloudKit dashboard. You can see it's in development, and you can see that there's an in development side and there's a production side to the app. Now, when you're in development, you don't actually need to use this to create records and data types and things like that. You can just do it in code, and CloudKit is smart enough to create the records and the fields automatically based on the information you provide in code. But before you send it to production, you need to deploy the schema and the database to the production side, and then that gets set up over here. So it's quite nifty to do things quickly here, but you need to clean it up before you move it to production. Now you'll notice here that it's also added push notifications. That's because there's a facility within iCloud, so that if on another device someone logs out or changes their password, for instance, then that can be notified via a push notification to all devices when that information has been updated. So that's a live update. That's what the push notification is turned on for. So that covers all of our configuration side. Let's look at saving and fetching data from the cloud. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our user data model, and I'm going to convert that into a singleton, and that's pretty straightforward. Static let shared and then we can get rid of this, and then we need to change all instances around. Okay, so let's fix that issue with user data. So now it's a singleton, it'll only occur once, and we don't need that. We need private there. Okay, so now we need to create a new model for our CloudKit. And we'll look CloudKit. And of course we need to import CloudKit. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate everything we did in user data. So you might recall user data was all of our core data, so that's where we're saving all of our information to the iPhone drive or the iPad drive. But now with the cloud, we're going to save that same information to the cloud so that we can share it amongst all of our drives. So we're going to still be using this enum and this structure for user, but we're basically going to duplicate all of this and put it in CloudKit. So we're still going to have a list of users. This class is going to be called CK user data, and really should be capital CK because classes begin with capital letters. Again, it's a singleton, and then we've got all of these functions in here which we basically need to read write. Add user is going to be the same. It's going to take username and password, and we're going to append it to our internal list of users. Check user is going to be the same because it's checking that internal list there, and login is also going to be the same. It's going to check our list of users. So the only things we need to read write for CloudKit are load users and save users. So let's look at our saving users. Essentially, the start, we're getting this entity name users, and in CloudKit they have a thing called record types. So record type is basically an entity name. I've got some code here. So we create this record type called, let's call it users instead of user. And we've got our internal list of users starting off as empty, and then we're adding to them. So what you go is we create a record of type users. Now if this users type doesn't exist in our development environment, then CloudKit will automatically create it for us. That can't happen in production. In production we need to have already defined it, but in development it'll define it on the fly. So we're doing the same as we did down here for the entity. We're going, instead of set the value, we're setting an object. We're putting in the username and password, and then we've got this private DB. I suppose we better create that. So up here, we need a reference to our CloudKit, which is called a container. And so we need our private database, which is going to be a CK database, and it's going to be equal to a CK container dot default dot, we want it sent to our private cloud database. So on initialization, that's going to be set. So a container is all the data to do with this application. There's a default container. You can create different containers if you want. And then there's basically a private cloud database, which is only accessible by the person who's logged in. And there's a public cloud database, which is accessible by anyone who's using this application. So it's our applications container. If it's public, anyone using our application can access it. Private, username and passwords, so it goes in the private cloud database. So going back down to save, we've got our private database. We want to save our record, and our saved record, it's going to return a closure of our saved record and an error, and if there is no error, we go save, otherwise print unable to save. Okay, so you can see how it's pretty similar to how it was working in Core Data. Now, similar is true for load users. We've got the setup stuff here for Core Data. We will put in our code for CloudKit. So again, when we're loading, we're going to set the array to 0 to start off with. And the way querying the record type, we want to query the record type users. You might remember I renamed that for save. We need a predicate. I'm actually going to do an example on or a tutorial on predicates, but basically value is true is saying give us everything. So we want to query the users table, and we want to get everything. We go to our database and go perform the query. You can also have zones, which are sort of subsets of the container. So you might have unrelated tables that you might want to put in different zones. We're not doing that. So it's just nil, and then we have this closure. It's going to return an array of records. So if it could be nil because it could be no records. So it could return nil. Otherwise, it's going to return an array of records and an error value. If the error equals nil, then, well, we need to check that we've got some records, but if, so we have our guard statement, print no records, we can return straight away because we've set our users to an empty array. And then if records has a value, then we keep following through. And for each record, we want to go, let's get the record object. So for that record, we want the username and we want the password, and it's going to print out the username and password just so we can see it's come through, and then we're going to add that user and password to our internal array of users. Otherwise, we could have an error. There's an error with CloudKit, and we just print out the localized error. Otherwise, we'll print out error. So that's basically replacing all of this from writing. So it's writing to and from CloudKit. Now we need to figure out a couple of little initialization things, like how do we know CloudKit is logged in? So how do we know if we're logged into CloudKit? It's a little bit like Game Center. We have to set up as a capability. We need to tell Apple that we're using CloudKit. So we set that capabilities function here under login. So we've said, hey, we're using this. So how do we know if we're using it? There's a couple of different ways, but we've got a little function here called test CloudKit that we've written, and it returns whether it's true or false. And it just says if FileManager.default.ubiquity identity token. So we get one of these tokens if CloudKit, if we're logged into CloudKit. So return true if we've got one, return false if we don't. So we can use this to test whether or not we're using CloudKit. So now we want to know when we're going to call this test, and obviously we want to test pretty early on in the system. Okay, so let's skip back to the user interface just for a second. I've already created a label and another switch to say, yes, I want to use the iCloud, and this is quite similar to Game Center insofar as it has to be the cloud has to be turned on by the user. They need to be logged in the settings. You can't log them in from within your application. So really what this switch is doing is testing whether or not they want to save data to and from iCloud, but they can only do that if they're logged in. Now most people by default are going to be logged in because they're saving their facilities, you know, their pictures and things like that, other settings, etc. But we can't just assume that they are. We need to test for it. So one thing we need to do is, by default, it'll be off, and people are going to opt to put it on. And so when we click on this switch, we need to actually test to see if Cloud Center is logged in. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to test when the application starts up, if they're using iCloud, then that wants to be saved into the user defaults. So there's a couple of things we need to do. So if we go to user defaults, I've created a new variable here called using iCloud, and it's a false boolean. And when we load the user defaults, we need to get that value. Use iCloud is user defaults.standard.boolean for cloud iCloud. And down here, when we save the user defaults, we need to save that setting. Save use iCloud equals use iCloud, and we need to set it in the user defaults, and we need to synchronize it. We need to pass it here to the save user defaults, so it's going to be hopefully that will get rid of that. Okay, and then when we compile, we've got a whole heap of missing parameters, so let's find all of those. And it's going to be use iCloud switch dot is on. Same here. Now this is in the Game Center code, so if we're using Game Center, we're not using the cloud, so we can safely assume that that is false. And in the login view controller, the login conceded, then that is use iCloud, use iCloud switch dot is on. Build again, still got another error. So pedantic, these compilers. Okay, so just rapidly, what we've done is in the storyboard, we've added this cloud, set some constraints so it looks pretty, etc. We've added a couple of actions, and we've got use the iCloud switch, which we're going to do now, which is the action when someone clicks on the switch, and we've also, well, we've got an outlet, but we don't actually do anything with that currently. So let's go into the login view controller. And now what we want to do is when someone clicks on the switch, we've got this action. And so we're saying we get the switch sent to us and we say, is it on? So we want to test for the iCloud. So we look for our user data shared. We call our test CloudKit function. If that returns true, then CloudKit is configured, i.e. it's on. Otherwise, CloudKit is not configured is what we're going to print out, and we need an alert set off, set using iCloud to off. So we need to show an alert, and then basically we're saying to the sender switch that tried to turn itself on, nah, go back to false because CloudKit is not available. So this alert that we're going to write is just basically going to say that that you need to go into settings to go to CloudKit, and we can actually put two messages in there. We can put a message for settings, and we can have a message saying close, and we'll do that right now. Okay, so what we've done here is we've created an alert. So the alert just comes up and says CloudKit, and the message is go to the settings to enable the CloudKit. That's presented modally, and we've got two actions. We've got a close action, which is just the cancel style, and it does nothing apart from close the window. And the second action is the settings, and if they click on the settings, we want to go to this self.open settings we've created up here. It needs to be made available to Objective-C, and you might recall we had this GC action which was going to settings for Game Center. We can basically copy and paste all of that code and move it to this open settings function, and then back down here we just need to put open settings, and that's some nice modular code for us. So if CloudKit is configured, we don't really need to do anything, and if they've turned the button off, we don't care if CloudKit's on or not. So that helps us in our initial case of when CloudKit is being used, and of course in the login button, well, we'll come back to the login button, but when we're saving the defaults, we're now saving whether or not the CloudKit is on or not. So what we need to consider is in our app delegate, when we initially load up and we load the user defaults, what do we have to do? Do we need to load our core data, or do we need to load our CloudKit? So we check our user defaults. We've saved whether or not we're using the cloud or not, and so when we're logging in, we need to figure out whether or not we're loading CloudKit or whether or not we are using core data. So what we need to do here is we need to test when we load the user defaults if we are using the iCloud and we're not using GameKit, and that shouldn't happen, that testing and using GameKit, but we'll put it in just in case. So if we're doing all that, then we are using the iCloud, and so we want to go CloudKit user data.shared .load users, else we're probably using the GameKit, or we're using some other technique where we're using our local core data. So we just want to load our user data, which is our core data .shared .load users. Okay, so we've got pretty much everything we need. However, we need to go back to our login view controller, and when we actually log in, we need to figure out which one we're saving as, and this isn't too difficult. I've already written the code here. So if we're going to be using iCloud, then we'd use the CK calls for check user, add user, save users, and I've created these login succeeded and login failed functions to refactor the code to make it nice and professional. And if we are not using iCloud, then we're using core data, and we make the relevant calls through there. That pretty much covers everything except to test and run it, and I'll leave it to you to do that because I've done it several times. and it's definitely working. I'll upload this to Login 5 and you can download it and hopefully see how it is running. Cheers. There you go. CloudKit is saving our username and password in a private database in the cloud. This allows us to log in on any device if we are connected to Apple's iCloud. Next session, we'll be adding Firebase, so look out for that coming soon. If you have any questions about this tutorial, then please leave a comment below or hit me up on Twitter @SwiftAlmanac. Please subscribe to the channel, it's free, and check out our website at www.swiftalmanac.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.